All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Happy New Year to you, I suppose is in order. I hope that the holiday time was okay for you. Thanks for tuning in. If you're new, welcome. Everyone else, what's up? Do you do the New Year's resolution thing? I usually do not. I have a whole thing about New Year's resolutions. I've written about it before. I don't like this idea of my behavioral patterns supposedly all being addressed with one wish that I make at the beginning of the year or whatever it is. Like, I like to think of paying attention to my behavioral patterns and seeing where I can make adjustments to them, tweaking the formula of my actions and attitudes. I like to consider that a year-round effort, needing daily reassessments. However, this year I actually do have a resolution, and it's not something that I tried to come up with or really intended to have. It happened of its own. And it was an interesting revelation and is relevant to a lot of the conversations I've had here on this show around receiving guidance. I talk about going inside and making yourself quiet and hearing a voice of knowing from within. Maybe you've heard something like that before. That's very common in yoga circles, that idea that we could do that. And I've then talked about how sometimes when you're able to hear that voice, you can also get messages. And I think that when I have spoken about that, or when it's been discussed here on the show, it's made out to seem like it's a very contemplative, meditative thing that you make yourself quiet and then you're able to hear it, you know? And I realize that a lot of times the messages aren't these like quiet, glimmering rays of light that come from the heavens or beyond in the midst of your meditation, you know? Sometimes what happens is you behave poorly, like you do something that isn't how you want to be, let's say. You slip into some old pattern, or you behave in a way that isn't really in line with your beliefs. And then the next day, as you're tormenting over the fact that you did this, or when you're like in a real kind of remorseful place of, oh gosh, I misstepped. I wish I'd handled that better. Where did that even come from, that behavior in me? You know, when you have those moments where you get away from yourself, it happens from time to time, right? Well, it's in reflecting upon that the next day where you're actually not in a blissful, calm place of receiving messages. You're actually looking at yourself and having to face things that are difficult, that feel shitty, you know? You acted in a shitty way, and now you're having to like reconcile that and decide if there's anything that you feel you want to do or you need to do to help reconcile it for yourself that you behave that way. And then in that moment, you get the message. The message comes sometimes from a place of having to face yourself. So that happened to me last night into today. And I'll be happy to share more with you about that. It actually has to do with my eldest daughter. If you listened last week, I did a year-end check-in. I talked about my youngest daughter. And it's almost like the same thing I've talked about, where I've talked about pain in my body and how sometimes if I have persistent pain in one place, like in my hip, and then whatever, I get a flare up somewhere else in my body. While I have the pain somewhere else in my body, the pain in my hip goes away. And then as soon as I address that other new pain elsewhere, the hip pain comes right back, like it moves around. Well, it almost feels like that. Like if I think of my family as the body, and the pain area, the inflamed area was my youngest daughter over the last year. It's almost as if, as that has come down and started to feel in a healthier way, some things become very clear with my eldest daughter that I need to try to put attention to. So, in any case, like I said, if you want to stick around to the other side of today's conversation, I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you what happened last night with my daughter and what my takeaways are. And it bears considerable relevance to today's conversation with John Stirk. I learned about John when I had Catherine Onnes on the show not too long ago, if you listen to that. And it took a little bit, but we ended up getting together. And the conversation that we had is really relevant to what's been going on with me and with the folks who were part of my inaugural group in the teacher training that I've been talking so much about on the show. A lot of those folks are finishing up. I think this is like the last week. And John and I talked about what I consider to be the subtle aspects, or what he calls the non-material aspects of teaching, of sharing in yoga, and what happens in the spaces between people. And I'm often wanting to get into areas and topics that have no words for them and see if we can find some words, if we can get somewhere in trying to point in the directions. And this conversation with John, I felt succeeded in that in many ways. I've thought quite a bit about it since we had it. I'm very happy to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, I do want to send some love to our podcast premium subscribers. Today in specific, I want to say thank you to Valerie Midget and Jacqueline Gilby. Shout out to you, Valerie and Jacqueline. You've been around for a while supporting this show, and we very much appreciate it. If you listen to the show and you want to get access to the full archives, or just be someone who's helping it continue, the way that you do that is become a podcast premium subscriber. It's choose your rate, cancel anytime. If you don't have money and there's an old episode you want to listen to, just email us. We'll definitely hook you up. But if you have even a little something to contribute, it certainly makes a difference. To learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or find out about any of my stuff, I got lots of things on offer. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I will definitely touch base with you on the other side, but we have a lot to get to, and I'm happy for us to do that. So let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with John Stirk. Hello, John.
Can you hear me, Jay?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Jolly good.
Very good indeed. So nice to meet you.
Thank you, and so nice to meet you as well.
Let me mention that I am already recording, and I'd like to consider us having just begun. I don't want that to be a surprise to you. Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine.
Good. Well, it is a great pleasure to have this moment to meet you in conversation. Your name came up when Catherine Onnes was here, and I've just been on a little bit of inquiry into Vanda Scaravelli over the last year or so, I'd say, just looking to try to meet people who maybe had some direct experience with her. And there's not that many people out there, honestly, that I've been able to find. And I will say to you, John, that in getting ready to talk to you, I was sort of saying to myself, how come I've never heard of this person before? And it makes me wonder about that. Like, you've been teaching throughout the whole, what I would call heyday of yoga coming into the mainstream. But I don't really remember you being on like a yoga journal conference bill or in the magazine. Am I wrong? Or is that something that you haven't, did you go into that more like celeb yoga world ever?
I think I touched on it. And I was in the odd magazine. I mean, I've written several books. Mm-hmm. Really, if you like, that's my kind of calling card. So I have an ability to express, or I have the opportunity to express myself through the books. But I haven't really got into what you're talking about. Not big time. I've been teaching yoga in one way or another probably since since the mid-70s.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Well, I guess was that like a conscious choice, or is that just the way it kind of unfolded for you?
I had back problems and I had depression, and I was a bit of a mess as a young man. And when I met my wife, she had been working with Iyengar and was also with a group of people that were around R.D.Laing. Who not long before that written The Divided Self, which was a big hit. It projected him out into the mainstream. And for me, Jay, it was just like coming home. It was amazing from the kind of life that I was living and the kind of health that I had at the time. It was a complete, it was more than a light bulb moment. It was extraordinary. So that was probably about 74, 75, I would think. So it kind of started there.
I'm curious about R.D.Laing. I don't know much about him, and I've heard you mention him as a kind of sort of significant influence. And I know Iyengar method, and maybe it was different back then, and I guess I'm curious about this too. A lot of people associate like a modern Iyengar method with just very technical physicalities, not necessarily like a lot of talk about philosophy or consciousness.
Yeah.
But R.D.Laing seems to be someone who's talking more about consciousness. Is that why he was an influence? And how do those two things connect, R.D.Laing and yoga?
Yeah, well, he had been a psychiatrist, stroke psychotherapist. And he was very interested in the way that people that were severely emotionally disturbed, how they were treated. And he did all kinds of things that kind of freed up the whole relationship between patient and therapist and so on. And in his book, The Divided Self, he was writing about schizophrenia. He wrote another very nice book called The Voice of Experience. I knew him quite well. We hung out as a group. He had houses in London. He called them the houses. And they were where disturbed people could go and spend time there without any medication and work through their stuff. That was very successful. Part of their therapy was to do yoga, say a couple of times a week. So people that I knew, I didn't, but people that I knew would go around and teach these people yoga. And within that group, you can't talk about mental health without talking about yoga. So we're all in one way, very gently or mildly or otherwise schizophrenic or psychotic. I mean, it's just the way we are. And the yogis recognized, as we all know, the turbulence of the mind over centuries. So the main objective of yoga was to settle the mind, as we all know, and through settling the mind was to invite a certain quality of consciousness to emerge. This is what the yoga project tended to be about. And Laing really was he'd been to India and he'd been up and he'd spent some time up a mountain for about 6 weeks with a guy And at that time, Laing was probably coming into the height of his popularity. And he was very interested in what the East had to say about the mind and consciousness and so on. And the story is that he went up there, left his family in the village down below, and spent, I think, about 6 weeks there. And he tells a story of sitting outside this guy's cave with a fire going, and the front of it, and they're just stripped down to loincloths. He said, and this is at night. He said, and the fire is almost burning the front of his body, and the back of his body is absolutely freezing cold from being way up this mountain in this kind of low temperature. And he said the guys spent the first period of time with him just laughing at him. He just kept laughing. I mean, it's just a wonderful story. And it was then, of course, it was from that Ronnie, I call him Ronnie, became interested in, is it called Vipassana meditation? You know, the meditation of being. And as a psychotherapist, and seeing lots of people, and in dealing with people's mental turbulence, he was very skillful. And all therapists hold that silence. You know, it's they hold the space, they hold the silence, and people at some point will come up with what they need to come up with. But his presence was extraordinary, and it's almost like he couldn't drop it. He had a unique understanding of mental difficulty, and at the same time, he had this extraordinary presence. Even socially, he had this extraordinary presence. So I was influenced by him and the books that he wrote. And as I said, the yoga practice, Iyengar's work, there was a very well-known Iyengar teacher around at the time that my wife used to go to as well, my wife Lolly, called Donna Holloman. Mm-hmm. And they were bending backwards 20 times and coming up from the floor and standing on their heads for half an hour and doing all that stuff that was quite extreme at the time. Mm-hmm. But the whole aim was to break down the tension, if you like, that the psycho-emotional, physiological tension that sustains our way of being in an untoward way. And of course it worked to a point, but everybody was a lot younger then, you know. People were taking LSD and doing yoga.
And doing back bends.
Doing back bends, all that stuff.
Well, it's interesting.
A long time ago, Jay. It's 35 years ago, you know, so.
Yeah, well, I got into yoga in like 93, maybe, in New York. We can get there, but I'm curious, when you told that story about R.D.Laing and them laughing at him, what do you think they were laughing at? They were laughing at how unsettled his mind was, or?
Totally. Yes, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see it. You can sense it. I mean, we sense it in each other. We sense it in ourselves, and we sense it in others. But obviously, for a guy that's been sitting there meditating for God knows how many years, and somebody from the West comes who's full of knowledge, who's written books, you know, the guy up the mountain, his slant on it was just to stop everything, and in stopping, the realization comes, and then suddenly this eminent guy comes to see him, who can't stop because he's so full of knowledge. I mean, it's Krishnamurti stuff in a way, you know, in one way.
Yes, it seems like it. Well, I'm also curious because the stopping and the allowing doesn't seem like the same thing as doing drop back, whatever, back bends like the Iyengar folks were. So I know that you are someone who, as you called it, made a shift from that kind of, like, as you've said, stretching and pulling and pushing and making an effort to another way, which I know was inspired by Vanda Scaravelli.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, I know that Vanda, I've only spoken to maybe one or two other people who knew her, and they all said that she only taught one-to-one.
She did.
And I heard you say in another interview that you were with her maybe, 6 times for like 4 or 5 days each?
Yep. About a half a dozen times over 2 years for 5 days at a time, yeah. All
right, so do you remember, well, first of all, how did that even come about? Like, how did you, like, get her number or schedule? Like, how did it happen back then when you were working one-to-one with Vanda?
Yes, I met her through a couple of teachers in London. a teacher called Sandra Sabatini, who works with the breath, who'd been a student of hers for a long time, would take me to see her, which was very, very useful. And then I just started going by myself. And that's how I met her. I think, obviously, she knew me. I said, can I come and can you teach me? She did. She lived in a beautiful house, a villa just outside Florence. So I used to fly to Italy and, go and see her. And she was amazing. She was a fabulous woman.
Do you remember your first lesson with her and what happened in that lesson or what it was like?
Well, she was very direct, and her whole thing was gravity and tuning into the pull of the earth.
Yeah, the grounding, right? The grounding.
Well, there's grounding and there's grounding, and we think we might have it, and it's hard for people to get. People couldn't get her thing for a while. And then you apply the exhalation, of course, which releases tension. And as time goes by, one begins to realize that the strength of the pull of the earth is extraordinary. And from an osteopathic point of view, because I spent many years practicing as an osteopath, so I understood the mechanics of the body. When I saw her move, you're asking me about the first session. Mm. So when I saw her move, and she was teaching postures and the breathing and bringing it together. And when I saw her move, there was all these micro movements that were happening through the articulations. It was as if she had nothing holding her body together at all, except for energy. I've never seen anything like it. Mm. And nobody could move like her. So her recommendation was that you did only simple postures. She used to do as she said, she used to do the more advanced postures for fun. And what I could see with my osteopathic eyes, because my body wasn't feeling it yet, was this person with enormous feet, quite small, very light. And you could see, because she was always talking about the waist opening, in two directions. She did a lot of standing postures, and if we're going back into back bends from standing, she would the whole of her waist would open in two directions. Her sacrum would move. It was fascinating. It was hypnotizing to watch her sacrum move. It would move in between the iliac bones. It looked like it was moving a quarter of an inch each way, without being held by anything. So as she went backwards, that went in, and then it would come back again. And the sacrum, I've never seen it. I've never seen it in Iyengar. I haven't seen it in anyone. That would move. It was like she was a living, walking example of very intelligent biomechanics. In terms that how grounded she was. When her waist opened in two directions, she was opening from the third lumbar vertebrae, which is the osteopathic center of gravity. Every single vertebrae in her spine moved. The curves were reversing. The spine was elongating and then coming back again. She would undo her shoulders. So she would receive the upward thrust from the ground through her feet by dropping her weight. But in the upper body, she would undo the upper body, the shoulder girdle, and the jaw, to actually release the tension, to exaggerate the weight going down. So it was a two-way thing. And the other thing if you looked at her diaphragm moving and her abdominal tissue moving, you could see how, people talk about, this is part of my work, but people talk about the central tendon of the diaphragm, you could see that how her diaphragm as a whole was the central tendon of the whole body, all the way down into the feet, all the way up into the arms, all the way up into the head. And the belly would just get stuck. People talk about move the belly back. The belly would just suck back. It was like I once went I was in a hotel, a kitchen in a hotel, and they had an extractor fan going, and a serviette suddenly got sucked onto this extractor fan. Well, that's what her abdominal tissues were like. They just was sucked back spontaneously by her exhalation. Yeah, that was my impression. It was a big impression.
Other people who've described meeting her were equally mesmerized by her movement. Other people have said like watching her move was something in and of itself.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, in the teaching of movements, did she talk about things in those kind of terms, like in those kind of biomechanical terms like you were, or was she directing in other ways?
She was very simplistic. It was the exhalation and it was the gravity and it was getting out of your own way. She was very interested in the tailbone. It's interesting because when you look at Iyengar, we're talking about biomechanics here. So we're talking about the way in. You know, the sensation is the way into something else, which we know. So we can talk about that if you want to.
Yes, we'll get there. We'll get
eventually. But the Iyengar was full of details, and you know, it was almost like every square inch of skin. He worked it, and he would always find something somewhere that wasn't awake enough, that he would say, "We'll point to this," and of course it would fit in with the whole picture.
Or sometimes he would hit him, right?
Yes, sometimes he
to wake it up or whatever, right?
Wake up that spot, that small spot. And because people's bodies don't wake up all in one piece, they wake up, you know, with his work, they wake up a little bit here and a little bit there and all the rest of it. Vanda, on the other hand, didn't give any detail, but the details came out of her work. So if you look at Iyengar's work, his detail became unification physiologically, and she started with the unification, and that people became very interested in the details of that. So suddenly people were feeling their inner thighs pull up, or they were feeling their pelvic floor move, or they were feeling the sacrococcygeal joint, you know, all kinds of things like that. But it was all going in the same place, you know.
Well, that idea that you just said about unification and details and kind of like outside in or inside out, maybe, that sounds very like philosophical to me. That's like philosophical frameworks for practice. Did Vanda ever talk about philosophy, or was she as equally kind of terse in her, or spacious maybe is a better word, in her teaching?
I think she lived the philosophy in a way. I think she didn't feel it necessary. I think that she'd spent time with Krishnamurti, who would go and spend time. They became friendly, and he would go and spend time at her house in Fiesole when he was not touring and not teaching and doing all the stuff that he did. So obviously, and I think she was around in various places when he was around, when he was teaching. Obviously, that rubbed off big time. And just being around him, I should imagine, would have rubbed off. And I think it's possible, this is my assumption completely, but because he was so deeply and so extraordinarily in what he was into when it came to the mind, you know, you read some of his books in the beginning when you're young, and you go, what is this guy talking about? You know,
as you get older, though, you start to go, oh my God, that's what he's talking about, or whatever.
I know that. Yes, of course, I know that, but it takes a while. So I think that she felt it really wasn't her place, because Krishnamurti used to call the yoga practice the exercises. He said, these are the exercises, and then she would teach him the exercises at one point in time. And so I think that she felt that because being in his presence, she probably, you know, he'd taken care of it all. There it was. What could she add to that? Was it her place to start talking about that when she had such a beautiful way of approaching the bodywork of yoga? You know, so that was her role. I think from my point of view, looking back and looking at the various things I've looked at over the years, I don't think I've ever seen a more intelligent approach to a forward bend, or just standing, or just laying down. And the other thing, Jay, that she said, which I thought was very interesting, which I came across again recently on some old notes that I found, that she felt that if you understand Shavasana, you understand all the postures. Not because it's an easy option, because the spine, the reflexes that hold the spine upright are dissolved. So in laying down with your spine on the floor, the body begins to do all kinds of things. So I think that's very, very interesting, very, very interesting, and it works.
I mean, it surely is. And what's coming to mind for me is, and I've heard you say this as well, and I think that this has generally been like the kind of case made for more physically oriented approaches to practice that don't like engage in other subtler contemplative forms, is that the physical practice is the doorway, right? It's a doorway to something. Right? And that's why when Vanda says Shavasana, you know everything, because that's when you enter through the doorway to whatever the practice is taking us to, which is maybe what she felt Krishnamurti was articulating better than she ever could. And I totally understand that.
Exactly. I mean, Osho's observation, formerly Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who was very, all about him.
Yes. We all saw the Netflix documentary, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. But obviously, he'd read Krishnamurti's books. He may have met him. I mean, it's all coming from the same place in one way. Krishnamurti had obviously read about Buddhism and all the rest of it. It's all coming from a very similar source way back, and then they expressed it in their own way. But Bhagwan said that he said, well, Krishnamurti is great, blah blah, but he doesn't give you anything to do. So there's no doorway. You go straight there. And his thing, he said, you just go straight there. And when somebody asked him, after towards the end of his career, his working life, did he think that many people had got his message? He replied by saying perhaps one or two. Mm-hmm. But he didn't give, as you said, Jay, as we get older, we begin to understand it, of course. But in the beginning, it's very hard to understand. So I think that Vanda's way in to the body, because it involved really refining sensation to the
awareness, right? It's about awareness and sensitivity, like all the elements that you would need or something.
Everything that you would need, anything that you would need to go deeply. So Vanda went deeply into the body, and you have to be sensitive to do that. You have to get out of your own way to do that. You have to learn about, you don't have to, but what you begin to learn about is the involuntary movements of the body, the small micro movements, the pulsations. People experience this in yoga all the time. At the end of the exhalation, which he was very keen on, which is a wonderful place to be, it was almost as if Krishnamurti lived at the end of the exhalation without knowing he was living at the end of the exhalation, because it was in his mind. So there was a great parallel between the two of them. I would recommend, if anybody, in terms of the physical work today, I would say, just get in touch with somebody who's interested in that kind of sensitivity, whether it's a so-called Scaravelli teacher. She didn't like that. She didn't like being called that. So people that worked around her said, let's call it Scaravelli inspired. That's a way around it, and she'd passed on by then. But to work like that, and to read Krishnamurti's books or listen to his tapes, as other people are doing that now, and you put those two together, because what she taught you to do, if you weren't doing it already, and it's never enough in the beginning, because our patterns are so well established. So one has to keep going. Like many people, many great teachers, she was very good at reminding us to listen. And we were listening to sensation. Listen to the body, listen to the body. She went on endlessly. Listen to the body until you started really listening. That makes a big difference. Krishnamurti's work was all about listening and looking. Noticing what's happening. Don't try and change it. You just create conflict. Just noticing what's happening, looking. So on several levels, that's just one of them. Very, very similar approach. And in both cases, both emphasizing the need, if you like, to go more deeply into oneself. So you need time for that. You have to wait for that. You have to trust it. And it's just very beautiful, really.
I mean, it is very, very beautiful. You've said so much there. I guess the one thing I would say is that I've observed, and it certainly was true in my own practice and many other people of sort of like my generation of teachers, is that many of us kind of went through a ringer of, this like almost fitness oriented practice sometimes, or even a lot of us who wanted to get away from fitness orientation. It was still so much physicality and so much doing. And I don't know if I read Krishnamurti was definitely a big doorway for me, but I think a lot of other teachers, it isn't philosophical. A lot of people have gotten into like more somatic movement modalities, which we've been talking about on the show. And there's a lot of similarities in terms of the way someone like Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, or, even I was talking to someone about hanosomatics and like these other kind of areas of like inquiries into the body that are actually in certain ways more what you're describing in terms of like sensing and being awareness and being able to notice without trying to like impose upon the system in a Vanda Scaravelli way. And I think now, to me, what's interesting about it is when you remove the emphasis on like accomplishing with the physicality, what you're doing in practice opens up into like a kind of nebulous realm that no one knows how to talk about, which is, I think, what's exciting about yoga too.
Exactly. For me, it's all based on sensation. And some authorities on the subject talk about consciousness. So if you start with consciousness because the mind hasn't developed yet, and then when you further down the line, it becomes the mind, and then you come back to consciousness. You come back to consciousness with a difference. So we're not just talking about being consciously awake and alert. We're talking about the nature of consciousness and its possibilities in relation to our conditioning and so on.
I'm curious about the practice process and how the engaging of the body leads to this deeper understanding of consciousness, because it's not about being able to do the forms anymore, as I was saying. What you're actually doing in practice, like what are you actually doing if you're not doing the physicality?
Well, okay. Well, I think that obviously the physicality is very, very essential on one level for most people. And I think coming back to where I was going, talking about sensation, that some people say that consciousness itself has evolved from sensation, from sensory input. So all the gravitational reflexes and the kinesthetic information coming from the organs have all contributed to consciousness, which has contributed to a mind. Obviously, there's other factors involved. So when you start looking at sensation, and these wonderful people that you've just mentioned that take it very slowly and get into sensation, when you start looking at sensation, there is a base of the whole base of sensation is sensitivity, and the base of sensitivity is awareness. So you can't wake up physiologically without waking up other stuff, whether you're intending to or not.
Listening, like you said, listening, right?
Yeah, listening. And one of the first things in the old stretching days, one of the first things that happened to people after a while, their head cleared. People started their heads to, because they weren't carrying around such ingrained tension, and as you release the tension. So to release the physiological tension, so what are we doing in yoga? What are we doing in yoga? So you're on a yoga course, and so there you are. So starting from scratch, yoga teacher's course, whatever.
Well, it's funny you bring that up, because I recently, after many years of swearing them off, started to do a teacher training. And I heard you talk about that. Like, where do you start if you're doing a teacher training course? Do you start with philosophy or experience, right?
Yeah, you see, you can start with one word. You could have I would use a blackboard, because I'm at my age now. I'm not particularly good at technology, but if I had a blackboard, first day, I've got 25 students sitting in front of me. They've never done yoga, but they're going to start doing yoga and do a teacher's course at the same. I put up the word noticing.
Noticing, yes.
And then on the last day, 5 years later, full-time course, 3 days a week, I put up the same word again, noticing, which may be more meaningful. And that noticing applies to the physical sensations, and it also applies to our internal behavior. And what the physical sensations do, as the awareness wakes up, if you're in something, and you're in something with your body, and that's why the postures, I think, should be simple, and one should spend time in them. If you're in something and you're observing your sensations and you're refining them just by noticing them without fiddling about too much, although there may be a little bit of that in the beginning, you can't go into that without noticing what your mind is doing. We all know this. It's not
That's what gets in the way. That's what gets in the way of the listening.
Body's not the problem. It's got nothing to do with being stiff or flexible. Flexible people have got extraordinary patterns of tension in their system, which is it's not their fault, but it's to do with their personal history. And you can be flexible and you can still have a held core, which is to do with your perception, how you perceive life. So no one's exempt, and it's not to do, even though flexibility for many people may be a byproduct. But it's sensation, awareness, sensitivity, noticing how you are, so that when you're out in a bar or a restaurant or you're with company socially, that you don't leave that behind. You don't leave that noticing behind. And that's the whole reason for yoga, that it obviously makes us healthier, but it also makes our our behavior more intelligent. And that's not easy, but that comes. And that's also very, very beautiful. So one, as you know, Jay, you've been doing this for a long time. As you know, one notices in a given situation, or even when one's by oneself with oneself, that, I didn't react to that like I normally do. That didn't affect me so much. Or, it's where we get the benefit as well as the health. It's how we conduct ourselves internally, what we notice, and how can we change that if we feel it needs change. It may be emotional discomfort for any reason. Certain things, trigger us in certain ways. So how can we? Now, Krishnamurti would say that we deal with that by not by trying to change it, because that creates conflict, but just by looking at it, being aware of it, noticing it. So if I can notice the skin at the back of my waist, if I can notice how my sacrum is relating to the fifth lumbar vertebrae at the end of an exhalation, if I can notice that at the end of an exhalation, then the pulsation of my spinal cord, which may be a little bit advanced for some, it's there, becomes more obvious, comes towards me, then that mental space that is allowing those things to happen, and in the noticing of them, they respond. So in the noticing of untoward internal behavior, coming off of the back of sensation, when you're not doing the physical practice, there's something very deeply inside us that we read about, that we know about, that is untouchable and immovable. And that's where the power of yoga comes from. The emotional power is the support. So that's what we're touching. In terms of the physiology, we're touching very, very deep neurological and fluid rhythms and so on. And as far as the mind is concerned, we're touching that inner space, and people call it the void. We're just touching that, and we can't go there. So it's coming from a place that we don't know. And not knowing something probably is one of the best things that can happen to us.
Well, I think listening to you talk about that, I've certainly had the experience of noticing the wonder of my own body. Like when you talk about that, noticing those things, that the function of your breath and the way that your body is this kind of mystical phenomena in a sense. And I guess my curiosity is that I think for maybe even a lot of people listening to this show, if you do it for long enough, right? If you have a consistent enough practice over time, and then maybe even you're a teacher as well, who then has that kind of vantage point that you're looking at practice from, at some point you do start to notice other things. And it's something I've been talking a lot about on the show. I always say the subtle aspects. I've heard you refer to them as non-material aspects.
Yes, that's right.
And that's sort of where you were just pointing at this like inner, deeper force or space.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious about that, or what's interesting to me about that, is as a teacher, I mentioned I've been doing this training, and I'm kind of finishing up these video modules for it. And when I really look back over, like, what is it that actually happens in my classes nowadays or over the last few years, after I think a lot of like the initial ground laying gets placed, and a lot of it is what I would call like intuition, inspiration, spirit, like sometimes it feels like even more like the most somatic experience of prayer.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you. It's all of those things, Jay. Absolutely. And I think there's something in, if you're working with a live group, there's something in the space between you. You getting to the level of quantum physics, which is always looking for explanations about those kind of things. But there's something about group, it's energy, and there's something about group energy. And if the entire yoga project over the ages, through the centuries, was about people sitting there, basically sitting there, stopping. And in stopping everything, what's there when you stop? Well, nothing is there. Everything is there. Something is there. But in stopping all the activity and just being there, we've been through this so many times over the years, all of us, and persisting with that, one is releasing, I don't think you can separate bioenergy from any other energy. So in releasing their energy, they came to their realizations through energy. Now that energy can be one person sitting there quietly, the energy that's arising, dissolving their mental activity because of its power. And of course, the realizations are simply, if you like, they're condensations of energy that gives the mind something to settle on. And they're relevant, they're entirely relevant, and we learn from them. But you get a group of people, which is what you're talking about. You get a group of people, what's happened with a group of people? So everybody's working with themselves, but the space between people, and there's research been done on what happens to people when they're in a group. So the group energy, which has been being released through their skin, it doesn't, one person's energy doesn't confine itself to that one person, it radiates. And I think heart radiation, if I remember, it's something like it radiates at least 15 feet in all directions from the body. So that's one person. So if you take 30 people in a large room with a similar focus, whatever their mental activity might be doing, each one may be having a slightly different experience, but it's all the same, fundamentally the same energy beneath that. Then you have an extraordinary field of energy that comes back and influences one person. So each person makes a contribution to the field, and the group as such comes back and feeds each person. So it's a two-way thing. And as you were saying, when you were teaching the group, what's happening? I mean, one could go into that more scientifically to say, well, what actually is the science of that? But just as an overview, it's very powerful. And I think people have much more transformative experiences in a group than they do, say, two people in the group or practicing by yourself or anything like that because of the energy that's released.
Well, I certainly think it's interesting to try to look at some of these things through scientific lenses. And I've had some people on to talk about morphic resonance and energy fields and sort of like kind of consciousness research even. But I will say sometimes like the scientific method, it tends to be too reductionist to capture these things. I've heard you describe this experience that you were just talking about as the soul resets itself.
Yes.
And the word soul is not a word I hear yoga teachers saying a lot. Can you say something more about what you mean by that?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm talking about that in myself. What is my soul? I think my soul is something that lays beneath my fear, my anxiety, my expectations, my knowledge, my personal history. I think it involves my capacity for love, either with a particular object of my love, or love across the board, which is I think that our conditioning, and we're all conditioned, and it's not all bad because we need to be conditioned to exist in this world, but a lot of it is not so good, and I think that conditioning is like a calcification of the soul. So everything that you can think about, I don't know what the soul is, but I know what it isn't. And I think that all those adverse influences that we have, if we have a soul, and I'm not necessarily talking spiritually, I'm talking about a deep part of us that understands. It's a form of understanding as well.
Isn't that spiritual? I'm sorry to interrupt, but isn't that the nature of spirituality? What you just said?
It is, but as soon as you mention the word spirit, well, I do. As soon as I start thinking down of spirituality, you feel unqualified to talk about it. Because it's
or God. Nobody wants to use the word God either.
No, absolutely. So I don't use that word. It's something that's inherent in us, and it's there, and it's all the things. So what isn't soul? It's untoward behavior, excessive mental activity, worrying, relationship. How are we in our relationships, and all the rest of it? So there's something in there that you could call soul, and I know that people talk about spirits floating around in.
Well, no, I don't think of it that way. But I think of it in the terms that you're describing. I've also heard you talk about something Krishnamurti said, which had to do with being totally undisturbed by yourself.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was a very interesting way to put it.
Yeah,
because if you're undisturbed by yourself, you recognize yourself as something that's not disturbed.
or something that's easily disturbed.
Yes.
You can. So this is it, isn't it? Jay, this is it, really. You come out of these fabulous retreats, fabulous workshops. We have something. However popular yoga's become in the last few years, however much it's been marketed and changed, and the story of Iyengar saying when Krishnamacharya, you must know this, was seeing Indra Devi in his house every day for a year, the American, I think it was in the 20s or 30s, woman, and Iyengar said, well, why are you giving it to the West? They'll ruin it. I don't think we have ruined it. I think we've got lots of our versions of it. It's just that we're so across the board with everything that a part of our, if you like, the way we are in the West. I think there's a faction that has taken yoga, and if you like, I won't say they.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.